So at this time, I'd like to welcome our session one speakers. We've got Jessica, Natasha, and Cheryl.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm really excited by today's panel and the opportunity to share with everyone the discussions I've had with Cheryl and Natasha as we've prepared. In the 2017 book, Degrees That Matter, Moving Higher Education to a Learning Systems Paradigm, Natasha Jankowski and David Marshall propose a paradigm shift to intentionally redesign a student's educational experience through an approach that is consensus-based, aligned, learner-centered, and communicated. In today's session, Natasha and Cheryl Aschenbach, the ASCCC Secretary and Accreditation Chair, will discuss how institutions may develop their own holistic learning systems and shape the evolution of the future of learning. I'm now going to move to the backstage to facilitate the chat and Q&A discussions with the team from ACCJC and Bakersfield College. I'll rejoin the main stage in about 30 minutes to share some of your questions with our panelists. Cheryl and Natasha, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks so much. And Sonia, Stephanie, thank you for having us to facilitate this conversation. Really looking forward to engaging with Natasha and with all of you. So make sure to keep your questions coming to the Q&A and have your own conversations via the chat as we have our conversation with you. I think as we get started, I just want to reflect a little bit on what Sonia just said and really appreciate her comment that learning really is the role of all of us or facilitating learning in our campus and communities and environments, because that's really what the book Degrees That Matter focuses on with the learning systems paradigm. And so excited to talk to Natasha a little bit more about that today. So Natasha, should we jump in?
Sure, thanks so much. And I loved the opening remarks. That was a wonderful setup and setting and just beautiful perspective, I think, to have on learning and assessment in general. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sonia. So in the book, you describe the development of a learning systems paradigm, and it's characterized as two of the things. Jessica highlighted all four, but two of them are alignment and consensus. Alignment is focused on defining relationships between the elements of a learning system with the ultimate goal of dismantling the systematic silos between departments that we often encounter in higher education. And we've seen this as some of us have worked on our mapping approaches, both previously and as part of our guided pathways efforts, as well as other efforts trying to break those bridges or cross bridges and build communities across the different fragmented sections of our campuses. So what are some of the barriers to alignment, and how do we as community colleges overcome these barriers?
Yeah, great question. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too, Cheryl, as we go into this conversation. One of the things that I think is important in this conversation is, while this book was written by a medievalist and a philosopher. So David Marshall, my co-author, is actually a medieval faculty member. That's his area of study in terms of what he does. And my background is in philosophy. And I think that assessment is all about philosophical questions and how do you know if you know, and who is a learner and what is learning and all of that. So we were tasked with looking at institutions that had been engaging with the degree qualifications profile in tuning. And you do not have to be familiar with either of those because what we found across these over 800 institutions that participated in these initiatives was, when we ask big questions about what are we all trying to do here, the process looks very similar. And on the alignment part, in terms of what barriers to that is figuring out who's doing what. And if we have built structures in a way that we don't talk to each other, if we have a history within our institutions of some turf wars or cultural tensions and what information we share with whom, and how we are positioned to support or reinforce, or sort of what our zero-sum game in that space might look like, these can become harder conversations than others to have. It's also historically, we think that learning is a classroom activity, and it takes place in a classroom or virtually in a virtual classroom. But as Sonia mentioned, learning happens all the time in all kinds of places, and it can be reinforced in all sorts of places and spaces. And one of the things that we most desire for our students is that they can transfer their learning, so that what you do with me, you can actually go and do somewhere else, or what you did in your job, you can bring in and reflect. And so into that equity space, do we have space for our students to be their full authentic selves throughout the entirety of our campus? So one of the hard barriers in alignment is figuring out what's all this stuff, what are all the things to which we need to align. In community colleges, a lot of times we start with programs and mapping, but what a program is a very tricky thing. And what sequences, how students move, a lot of our history of pipeline movement of students through institutions is based on how students move through 4 years, and not thinking about how students move through a system of education and how they engage differently with our institutions in that space and move from work to learning and back to work and working and learning all at the same time. So determining how can we support each other in different ways? What is it that each of our units and functional areas and environments are doing? And do we even have that shared understanding of where we're trying to go? Can all be very, very, very big barriers to alignment in that space. I think for community college, it's also sort of an additional area of confusion, and sometimes because we have divisions that were added in different ways to serve different missions. So you might have a continuing ed, there might be a licensure or a professional area, there might be a career and technical education that is separate from something else, there might be applied programs, and all of those have bureaucratic structures that make collaborative partnership difficult, but our students might not experience them in that way. And so thinking about how do our students move through, what kind of experience are they having? Where are they going to have conversations and with whom? And do we have walls that we need to take down if our students are moving through them to talk to other units? So it's possible, but we need to talk to each other.
That talking to each other is so critical. I think one of the things you pointed out in the book is just highlighting the research that shows that students aren't transferring the information perhaps from one area to another. I teach writing, and yet I hear from my colleagues in the sciences that their students can't write. Well, I know they can write. I've just seen them write the semester previous, but are we doing enough to help them understand that there are different contexts for writing? So writing for the humanities may look different than writing for the sciences, as well as writing outside for employment. And are we having those conversations between departments about those kinds of elements of student learning? But then the broader pieces about critical thinking and other forms of communication and quantitative reasoning. I think because we exist in our silos, and that's just really silos between faculty. But then, the learning systems paradigm really speaks to the entire campus. The student who has work study employment on campus, are we in any way linking, even if it doesn't to them seem related to their major, how can we relate to those soft skills, or what was called yesterday power skills, which I really like. So facilitating those conversations. And I think that's a second piece of the paradigm that I really appreciated, was about that consensus and the communication that's necessary to develop that alignment. And so in terms of recommending, it's like, have those conversations that we often overlook as necessary.
Yeah, and just to go off of that, Cheryl, in the consensus, we were really particular about this doesn't mean that we're all like, we reached a point of we all 100% agree, because in our disciplines and in our different units, we have fundamentally disagreements, and disagreements are okay. Like as faculty members, that's our bread and butter. And so, but we need to have a shared understanding of where we're all trying to go. And that does not mean that everything that I'm doing in my day-to-day or every interaction I have with a student is moving towards that end. There might be some things I have in my course that are course specific because it's important to my course. There might be something in my experiential learning that I'm doing that's just for that, and it doesn't connect. It doesn't need to be aligned. But if we have a thread like a writing, if we have like quantitative reasoning where we're going, hey, there are many ways to do this, and you need to think about how this connects. Are we making those connections clear to students, and are we having those conversations? If we say this is an instance of this other thing that we're all moving towards, how are we making sure that it is, and we're reinforcing each other so that we don't pass it to the next faculty member or the next programming event or someone else, and then our students leave going, I spent a lot of time writing, but I don't feel I am a better writer for it. But
fantastic. Thank you so much for that quick conversation. Let's go ahead and in the book, you argue that there's a difference between a learning paradigm, which really is about curriculum being learner focused and learning focused rather than institution focused, and a learning systems paradigm where we really look at all elements of the campus environment. And we've already spoken a little bit about that. It includes co-curricular activities, work experiences, and so much more. And that kind of comprehensively, that's all connected around student learning, that it's not just a function of the curriculum in the classroom. You argue that interconnectedness is necessary to create learners who see the connections between the system and the learning, as well as to help facilitate that transfer of learning we've talked a little bit about. On our campuses, we often want to consider our environment a system, and we call it that. So when you referred repeatedly to the systems that we work in, But often in practice, we fail to address the disconnections and silos that we just talked about relative to alignment. So why is it important we look beyond just the learning paradigm and the curriculum attached to that, and instead take a holistic approach to the learning system paradigm as we facilitate learning in our environments?
Yes, I love these big questions. So for us, it was really important. And when we saw institutions who had been going through this process of saying, what does it mean to get a whole degree, right? You get a degree from the entirety of our institution, it confers it. You had a lot of experiences along the way from very different units and all of life and employment and all of these things. So what's the value add and what does that really entail and look like? And so it was more than, in the vast majority of our initial work as institutions, we engage in curriculum and we look at how do we map and how do we address learning in that space. But our students are everywhere, as we've been saying. So to make it a learning systems, we need to say, okay, we can do mapping in a curriculum. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a helpful thing to figure out. What are you trying to do in your course? How is that connected, if at all, to mine? How can I explain to a student what the value add from a particular learning experience might be, or what learning outcome it might be, muscle they might be flexing in this course to work towards? But if that doesn't work for me, if a student's struggling, what other opportunities across the entirety of our institution do they have to engage in learning that supports that learning outcome? And that's why we wanted to get into that system. It also helps faculty members that are so overburdened with everything. And when you look in just your curriculum and you go, oh, now I got to add a course, or how am I going to fit this into what I'm doing? And we miss that we have partners all across our entire institution. You have people ready, willing, and able to engage in a collective learning with us. And so we can say, I don't need to put this into the curriculum. I can think about how there are opportunities across this institution to provide support towards this learning. I can think about the work that our students bring from their employment and their life and think about how that fits into these places. And so I don't have to solve it myself in a program or in a curriculum or in a course. And that opening of a lens of how we can work together to collectively solve a shared issue was for us the big push to go. It's one thing to be learning focused, and that's really important. But if we forget that we have many partners that can help us solve our problems because they're shared problems, then we are doing ourselves a disservice and our students, and also just adding so much extra pressure and stress to our already really worn out faculty. Self-care is real, people. So make sure you take care of yourself.
I feel like that also adds value or lifts the value of our partners on campus. We often look, and you've just said it, can overburden or put extra pressure on faculty. But when we think more collectively that we are all together responsible for this environment and the learning that our students do, to me, that elevates the folks who often think of themselves in a support role, whether they interact directly with students or not, to really being part of a learning experience. And that's exciting to me because we are all collectively in this and we all play a part in the students' progress and hopefully ultimately completion. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, and I think it also really helps validate for students that there are different places and spaces that learning is okay. We have a history in academia of and I'll just take writing as an example since we were talking about it. Excellent writing to us most often looks like an academic paper. We need to have some citations, maybe an APA, and all of these things. And then our students go out and sort of look back and go, why? Why was that what I spent all this time and effort doing in writing? When they could be incredibly wonderful bloggers, they might write the most explanatory letter to their grandmother explaining what they've been learning in their class to catch them up on it. And none of that counts. That's evidence that has no value in our current system. When we open up and say all these spaces where students are demonstrating that learning in student affairs and support services, out in work, that has value, we can now recognize it. We can say that learning counts, and that's an instance of this. And in that way, we validate our students, we validate their identity, and we start to also reinforce some of those equity issues that had come up earlier, where if we say the way that you know something does not count in this class, it does not have value here, we shut out our learners. But if we open up that system to say all of those spaces count and they all have value, that's also an incredible opportunity for our students to feel seen, connected, and address that there are different ways we demonstrate, and different is not bad, it's just different.
Terrific. Thank you. And I'm glad that you brought up equity. And that was definitely a huge focus of the conversation yesterday, but it arches and integrates all the work that we do. And so as we talk about kind of higher education's traditional role as a place to sharpen academic and workplace skills, things like critical thinking, communication, plus employment skills, when you touch on the application of equity in the learning systems paradigm, how do we integrate both the central focus, the ongoing focus of education, with the integration of our values, such as equity and racial justice? Are there ways we can design our learning systems to promote both equity and academic learning?
Yes. Yeah, 1,000 times yes. So I think for us, there's 4 parts of the paradigm that we saw, and each of them are very interconnected and work to address this. And when we did this work, when we were tracking and mapping the DQP, that work has evolved into a huge strand of equity work within the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment that came really out of those 4 areas that we were focused on originally. So we talked about alignment and consensus. So do we know what we're talking about within our own institution? And do we know how our different pieces, if we say these pieces are moving us towards something, move us towards that? But the last 2 pieces really are where that equity piece can come into play so elegantly in aligning our values with what we're doing in our day-to-day experience with students. And that was that it needs to be learner-centered, and it needs to be communicated. And when we were talking about communicated, it's really that I'm constantly telling you, not on like the first day, you got a syllabus, you're overwhelmed, all these things. And yeah, you're like, don't you remember? It was on that document. And you're like, I've lost it and I don't even know. And this is so important, even more now, and with our attention spans just incredibly limited, the amount of things going on for our students and our faculty and staff during a pandemic, the being clear in, this is what I'm asking you to do. This is why it matters. And this is how it connects to something else. And when you've done that here, that's the same thing. And helping teach that reflection, that metacognition, and that transference of learning. There was a great study that was done in student employment. It started in Iowa Grow, and it's moved into a variety of different models since then, where they would ask student employees questions about what are you doing in your job that is applicable to your coursework, and what are you doing in your coursework that's applicable to your job? And the first time you'd get asked, you'd get like a teenager response, like, what have you done today? And they're like, I don't know, nothing, right? So the students will be like, I don't know, I don't see a connection, because we've never asked them to look at that. As much as we have barriers in a systems view, our students have barriers put up for survival, which is like, I'm now going to class, then I now go to work. And then when this semester's done or quarter's done, this is over, I'm now doing this learning. And so it's inherently compartmentalized. So we have to be very clear to our students, there is a connection point here. There's a reason and design to all of the things that we ask you to do. It's not like we just did this because we're mean or we want to cause you pain, but there's a purpose behind it. And we have to make that purpose very clear to our students, make those connection points clear. And that can also even help close equity gaps in the work that's been done around assignment design by Mary Ann Winklemas, which I think is great. If anybody wants to look on how do you look at your assignment prompt to be clear for students so they can actually do what it is you're asking them to do. So really very cool stuff. But the learner-centered piece also says, we're very aware that our institutions were built not for students, or not for these students that we have in mind. And how can we ensure that every step of the way, we're not just going, oh, we're keeping students in the center, but we're actively involving students. We aren't assuming we know what's best for them. We're involving them in the process. They have agency in their learning. It's not the lucky few that figure out how to find the resources or navigate a system, but it's pushed into that. And so not only does that mean when you're in that learning experience, you're going to get more from it and have a better relationship with our institution, but we're also addressing those issues of systemic barriers and inequities that have been sort of baked into our institutions. And the only way to do that is to really have some of those hard conversations and engage in it. So long-winded way of saying yes, I think that there's definitely ways to put all of this together towards equity. Assessment does have a history in measurement, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if people want, and how that sort of impacted our equity conversations. But there's a ton of great work unfolding on what does it mean to infuse equity in assessment? What if assessment was a vehicle for equity? And what does equitable assessment really look like and entail on our institutions and our in a variety of ways. And I'm really excited to see that unfolding nationally.
Thank you. And I can see some chats scrolling by quickly, some comments, really appreciating your comments about equity and how important it is we have that student agency and that we are learner-centered. So thank you for that. As we think a little bit more into, you've mentioned kind of starting to look forward. How do we, as we locally and systemically implement a learning systems paradigm and address all of this, how do we continually improve our student learning so that we can obviously give students more success in the future? And as we do that, what can we anticipate as the future of learning over the next 5 years, or even, looking further into the future over the next 20?
Yes. And Cheryl, I would love to hear your vision perspective on this too. So I'll give you some time to think while I answer, but I really would love to hear your thoughts. And I think that's always an interesting question to ask about the future. It's particularly hard at this time. I have no idea what state budgets are going to look like in relation to higher education. Enrollments are going to be an interesting bag for our students moving forward. We've got COVID-19. There's a racial reckoning, leadership changes that are happening across higher education. And so I think I'd love to also hear in the chat ideas that other people have for this. But from where I sit at the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, the ones that I see is, I think, 5 years out and then a little bit beyond are the focus on how do we document our learning for our students in a way that's incredibly portable and digital. And so there's been work happening nationally on comprehensive learner records, which is I know I can do these things, and embedded in that is the evidence of it, which could have come from a course, it could have come from a co-curricular experience, and all of those sorts of pieces. And then it's digital, so I can take it. I can push them to you, I can push them to an employer, and really thinking about how are we creating data standards that allow that to be ingestible, digestible by those data systems. So on the one hand, as we work on our structures and systems, we need an infrastructure for technology and data that supports that, and that is just as flexible, adaptive, and embedded as our students are and how they move through our systems. So I would love to see that comprehensive learner record work really picks up, and that the way in which students have access to their records become different. It would be really, really neat if I'm going to push out 20 years, if I, as a student, could put forward something that I think counts as learning. I think I met this learning outcome with this demonstration. Tell me if I did. And then a college could say, I'll take a look at that in relation to this. Yes, you did, or no, you didn't. And really think differently too about how our students engage with our institutions in that learning as a currency sort of piece. But that's later. I also think because of all the conversations that have been unfolding in the last several years on equity and assessment, that we're really going to see some fascinating work on that, some frameworks, some models, really rethinking those demonstrations of learning to be much more equitable. And while it started as conversations and conference themes and all of this, I think we're definitely moving into the practice piece of that at this juncture. And so that will continue moving in that direction. And then the last one I think I'll add at this point is that also thinking differently about how we credential and bundle our learning. I know that later in the series there will be conversations on that. So I will just say there's been a national project called Credential as You Go. It's led by Nan Travers, which looks at how do we take chunks of your learning and credential before you leave, so it's enclosed in a credential and you can't lose it. And so when we think about if students start to navigate nationally a system of learning, especially when you're online and remote and I can sort of learn wherever at any place in time, how are we ensuring that does not get lost along the way as our students move, and what is the power or potentially the implications of credentialing smaller chunks of learning in that space. And so I think that'll be an interesting conversation piece that I cannot tell the future on at this point, but I know it'll be around in conversations. But Cheryl, what are your thoughts?
Oh my goodness, so many thoughts. Speaking of ways of honoring student learning, I think that has so much potential. And I think we're turning the corner with credit for prior learning and developing our systems that are really formal and structured, but at least are a step forward from where we've been from really sporadically awarding credit in those situations. But I think the potential as you speak, and hopefully not 20 years from now, where a student can present something, then say, this is my learning or my demonstration of meeting this outcome. I think we can get to that point, and that is exciting. The more credit for prior learning we can have students earn, the better they progress and pursue, and more likely are to complete. And so that part of it, I think, has a lot of potential. I think I think through some of the challenges, and I saw a couple comments in the side about needing to include our junior faculty in these conversations. And no knock to our more senior faculty, but we sometimes are entrenched in how things have been, and that we're uncomfortable with that change. And so really engaging in dialogue with our junior faculty, and with the students themselves about what their needs are, what learning can look like, and how do we really morph some of these systems and processes that have been entrenched in our system forever, to really make them into something that, again, is more learner-centered, more friendly, and ultimately leads to learning and completion in a really different way. I'm also excited about the different forms of delivery. And Monday we get to talk about competency-based education. And some of the folks on this know that I've been working as a Senate representative with the Chancellor's office in some of the CBE efforts. And just having different ways for students to engage in learning, some through CPL, but then CBE is another option, so that we can help students early on in that intake, that clarifying the path piece. Not only what path does a student need to be on, but how do we help them to choose that path that has the pedagogies that will work best for them. I think that's an exciting possibility, so that over time education becomes much more individualized in its approach, and meets the needs of each individual student. And then we're further addressing the equity elements of it as well. So, a couple of my thoughts for you there.
No, I love it. I know, Jessica, you're back. Can I say one thing to Cheryl? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I think, Cheryl, you also raised an excellent point on thinking about, if we view that learning systems and we start to think that way, sources of information to help us make changes that benefit students can look very different. And so one of those that we saw from some of our work was the role that adjunct faculty play, or our part-time faculty, in the decision-making within institutions. And so we did these national assignment charrettes. It's a fancy word for an assignment design workshop. Happy to talk about it. If you have questions, put it in the chat. But we did one with adjunct faculty only, and we did it on weekends. They could come and all these things, and they brought their 3 assignments from each of the different campuses they worked, like where they were working, and they would, in these conversations with each other, would go, well, I give this one here, but the students, like, they don't understand it, they don't get it, and I see them in the summer when they take this class, and this assignment really works. And they had just this picture that was so different from the faculty that we'd had the week prior, who are in their department doing their program, like thinking very deeply about that, but their view was institution specific and not that larger piece. And we were like, oh my gosh, can you make this change? And they're like, no. And they're like, how do you get this information to faculty? Like, how can you pass this forward? And so thinking about, where might there be sources of information that we have historically overlooked, or not asked questions that can help inform. And just one other one that's a great example of that is a career services center that they did mock interviews. So they would ask students, like, give me an example of a time that you demonstrated the following knowledge and skills, right? And they had all this data from those mock interviews of where students said they demonstrated different types of learning. And they had been trying for months to get into like the curriculum committee, but they couldn't get put on the agenda. And so we were there doing interviews for a different reason on assessment with faculty. We're meeting with the curriculum committee, and we're like, oh, we'll bring you in with us. And they're like, we have all this information. Students say this is what really works for them for critical thinking skills. This is problem solving for them. And they're like, we had no idea. And that information just wasn't part of our routine. And so thinking about, what is all that data that could be really helpful that we don't see when we don't think system? But, not to add to people's plates, but just a couple good examples to take that.
No, that system approach is so important for so many reasons, right? Right there to have that, acknowledgement and that evidence of learning, not just what we assume is learned along the way. So fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl.
And see, I'm sitting here, I hate to jump in and interrupt you too, because it's a great back and forth, but we're getting questions. The chat box is going crazy. Do you feel like answering a couple questions?
So Cheryl gets the first one. No.
Oh no, but first I want to say, I just saw a comment go by. I, kind of out of the corner of my eye, I can see the chat. And I think Candace Newton said something about should we engage in academic humility and introspective analyses of our own epistemological theory histories? Like, yes, absolutely. Yes. I think sometimes as faculty, we don't give ourselves enough credit. I know we do that reflection often, but do we do it with others? And are we really, do we have enough humility to rethink and re-engage? And in some cases, yes, and others, it's really uncomfortable. And how can we encourage our colleagues to undertake that effort and create change in a really safe environment? It's a whole nother conversation, I'm sure.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great segue to one of these questions. And so I'm going to jump in with this one. So where does can kinesiology and the arts fit in? Our discipline feels left behind. You know, we've been talking about how to tear down silos across academic departments. This question spoke really deeply to me because last year I had a faculty member come to me. They were on a panel with a colleague from a different department, and they felt that colleague had said disparaging things about their discipline. And I found myself kind of adjudicating, and more importantly, bringing them in just to talk to each other and get a better understanding of what they're doing across disciplines. So how does a discipline who maybe feels like a bit disconnected become a respected part of the learning paradigm?
Natasha, you want me to jump in on that one first?
Whichever you prefer, go for it, Cheryl. I got your back.
All righty, sounds good. For one, I have a background in kinesiology, and then I moved into the arts with English, and so I understand that as a member of a department in kinesiology, athletics, fitness, and health, like there is such an exclusionary kind of feeling often. You're disconnected from the campus and from academia as a whole. It often can feel like, and so I think first and foremost, we have to bring our arts and our kinesiology and our CTE colleagues. You know, that really is part of that breaking down the silos and engaging across elements. Most people don't realize kinesiology is a whole lot of sciences, as well as things like communication and psychology. And so, you know, when you start to kind of put away the assumptions you have about your colleagues' disciplines and really listen to engage and you know, go see what they're doing in their spaces. And yes, that takes time and energy, but you know, having a better understanding and I think respect for each other is first and foremost one way to try to bring the arts and kinesiology and other, you know, who may feel like those, you know, outcasts, to bring everybody into the fold.
Yeah, just to go off of that, I'll take an assessment perspective from it. And I also have a background, my first professional career was in music before I was like, I'm going to go do philosophy and then assessment. So, you know, figure that one out, whatever's going on up here. But it was really fascinating for me when we started engaging in all these disciplinary conversations with disciplines and the crosstalk that would happen as they would talk to each other as though they expected the other person to be at an expert level of their discipline. Yes. Like, how can you not know that we do this? And they're like, you just told me you don't even know what I do. Like, what? How is this going both ways? And so at first we were sort of like, how do we engage with this? How do we address it? And then also add the double layer of within disciplines, dislike of different perspectives. And so they'll be like, within a humanities, they're like, oh, you did communications, but like, what kind of communications? Like, are you one of these groups over here? Because I don't know. And so I would say, first off, don't take it personally. So remember to breathe and have a moment before engaging. But to Cheryl's that, you know, really be the example and how can we create safe spaces for conversation? And for us, where we've seen that be really effective has been, interestingly enough, around assignments where people don't come with their favorite assignment they love, but an assignment that's just not quite working, and we mix them up in with different disciplinary members. And the strength of that is we tell them, you're going to have somebody that's looking at it like your student who does not know your discipline like you do. And so having other faculty ask questions like, why are you using this word? And what does this mean? Helps that reinforce, like, you don't know what I do, but I also don't know what you do. So like Cheryl was saying, in terms of my understanding of your discipline is really limited. And I think my favorite example of that was we had a welding faculty that was sitting at a table with religious from a religion department faculty, and they had ethics assignments. It was like for gen ed, and one of them was ethics. And the religion faculty immediately were like, you do not have an assignment on ethics in welding. Like, what possibly can there be ethics within welding? And the welding faculty were like, well, I really like your input on this, like, religious studies department. And they had an assignment that was, you are a welder, you've been contracted, so like you're subcontract on a larger project to do a series of welds. And you get to this work site and you go to do your series of welds, that's like all that you've been hired to come out and do. And the material is no good. It's like brittle. You can do the welds, but you know it's not going to hold. So you go tell the foreman, hey, this isn't going to hold. What do we do? The foreman's like, I don't care. I paid you to come do some welds, do the welds. And it's a bridge. What do you do? They're like, that sounds like an ethical dilemma to us. And the religious faculty were like, well done. Okay. Level set and like get into a conversation on like, where does ethics show up in our learning? And so having spaces where we can assumption check each other, never a bad thing, but hard to do. So I wouldn't say don't call it like an assumption checking tea time, but having ways that you can get into a conversation that gets to that can really help some of those misunderstandings that we have that we didn't even know that we had.
No, it's great. You know, you reminded me of, for schools who have adopted the guided pathways model, the development of pathways early on involved faculty sitting down with faculty from different disciplines to try to find similarities, you know, who would fit within a pathway, what makes sense and what didn't. And what came out of that was a big surprise for a lot of us. You know, you kind of think two disciplines are alike and realize, oh no, they're very different, or things that you thought were different were actually had a lot in common. English and chemistry degree here too. So let's shift gears a little bit. We have an assessment committee question. So how do faculty assessment committees develop effective guidance for authentic assessment to go beyond a merely compliance mindset?
I'll tackle that one first, Cheryl, if you don't mind. Okay, I got the thumbs up, so I'm good to go. So I would say, first of all, it is important to just state that because of how assessment was introduced in the accreditation process in the 80s, there's a lot of reporting structures that are built around assessment. And so most people are familiar with assessment because of a report that they had to submit their first time around. I would also add that most of our faculty remember that. And so if you come in as a new administrator or a new assessment person, you're like, we're doing assessment, it's going to be great. And they're like, I remember that form that I filled out every year that I still don't know where it went. And I don't know what that date has happened, like whatever got that used for. And I bet you probably did something about me about it. Whatever all of that sort of feeling might be mixed into it. So first off, the vast majority of institutions have at some point a very robust compliance reporting system structure that was built around assessment. And that is how people are familiar with and understand assessment. They think about assessment either as a test or as a report. So to move beyond compliance, to get to that improvement focused, if you're feeling like that's where you still live as an institution, having I know, we're aware, this was built for that, you know, maybe we wrote learning outcomes 10 years ago, that we have never gone back and looked at, that actually have nothing to do with our current instructional design, don't really mean anything to our program. And so if you're asking me to go and pick those up, like, why would I map to that? That's not relevant to us now. So owning that we probably have a system in place at one point in time, maybe not now, but at one point in time that was not beneficial, that was very compliance oriented, and we get it, is important to move forward. If we act like that's not true, or it's a new thing or different, you get a different kind of resistance, but just owning that that was real and happened, very helpful. Then the next thing is to start with, well, what are the questions that you have about your practice? Like, what do you think your students are doing really well? What do you want for your students? What are those values that you really want them to leave knowing and being able to do? And where do you think you're getting that? And what do you think you really do well as a program? Or where do you have questions as a faculty that you think maybe they're getting it, but you're not sure? And start with those questions of praxis that I have about, am I doing right by my students? Am I getting them to where I want them to go? Because if we engage in assessment just to do assessment, the end is assessment. Nobody wants that. I'm an assessment person and I don't want that. I don't want that for any of you. And I also don't want that your end is a report. Of course, we wouldn't use it if it was submit a report, because I just did the job. I submitted the report. So the end should be, I'm answering questions of value that I have about my students as learners, that I have about my practice, that I have about how I can get better to meet my students where they are and move them where I know that they can go, and the ways in which I can meet the goals that they even have for themselves that they brought to our institution and their classroom. So any of those questioning stance that are built around how are we improving and are we doing right by are so much more meaningful and lead to conversations than well, I'll just add a box to this report form. That will do it. So I would say you have a communication campaign ahead of you. That's a really important one. And we do have resources for that. So while Cheryl's telling you her answer, or Jessica's asking the next question, I will put into the chat a link to where you can find some toolkits on communication and how to think about talking about assessment to your faculty and staff and others.
Thank you. I'll just add real quickly, I was glad you have resources for communication, because I think that's so much of it, that if we really look at having dialogue about assessment rather than the reporting of assessment, and the challenge is, as we bring in new faculty, it's often, it's in the contract, you must do how many SLO assessments in a semester, and you must turn them in this way. This is the process. Where again, if we can get to those junior faculty a whole lot sooner and really talk more holistically about why we're assessing and why we're reflecting on that assessment, I think that's critical. And it really involves, again, having that safe space for conversation and risk, and kind of having that humility to say we are all constantly improving. It's not just about institutional continuous quality improvement. It's about personal continuous quality improvement, right? And we hesitate to do that sometimes as a whole. And so having the spaces on campus and the colleagues to have those conversations with, I think, are so important and can help with that shift.
And you're making a great point about creating a safe space so that people can reflect and not feel like this is something that'll be held against them, right? I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So for institutions that are interested in changing the way they design degrees, what do you think is the first step?
Yeah, changing the way they design degrees. This is a problem, because I have follow-up questions. I'll be like, tell me more about what you mean by this. But that's also my background in philosophy. I'm like, words, what are these words? What's behind these words? So my apology. But I think if you're really trying to say, the first thing is do we know why we do the things that we do? Since we talked about communication a minute ago, I'll bring up, if there's any communication folks on this webinar chat with us, Toulmin's argumentation model can be your best friend in any of these situations. So the vast majority of times in institutions, we give you evidence and a claim. So we'll say, our students are satisfied based off of this survey that we did. Therefore, we're awesome. Our students submitted this writing report and we graded it as okay. Or we had a rubric and they did this. And so therefore, we are quality. And we jump over the part in the middle that's the warrant. We jump over the why. So having conversations of, do we know why we do the things that we do for these students that we have, not the ones we think we have or the ones we wish we had, but the ones that we have. Do we know why we do this for these students, and why we think doing this will get them where we want them to go? We cannot make causal claims of that it was because of us that you improved. There's so much that happens in a student's life. Like if we got to put in a little balloon and like set it free and watch it float away and give up our ability to make causal claims about our institutions, we can do that after this event. But we can make arguments based on inferences. So we can argue that having these experiences adds value. We see this kind of thing coming out of it. We think it's important for the following reasons, and this is why we're engaging in it. We have not had those conversations within our institutions regularly for quite a long time. And so I would say the first step in any of that, reimagining the degree, getting into any of this, is the why. And for whom, and do we know who our students are? And are we assuming, or do we really know? And getting into that is an excellent starting place that will build a nice foundation for your new awesome house of degrees.
I'd add to that, are we asking ourselves the why? I think we've had some practice with that this spring, having to respond to COVID. And as some of our harder to convert disciplines moved into the online or mostly online environment, rethinking how we deliver instruction and what's the reason for this assignment. I think a lot of folks did some redesigning as they survived the spring and then ventured into summer and fully embedded themselves into new spaces in the fall, I think. And so perhaps taking some of that experience and again reflecting on it together and applying that same kind of thinking to our degrees and our certificates to why are all these pieces here? And what role are they playing, and what are we really hoping for the student to gain at the end? And again, thinking of that, I think first and foremost from an outcomes perspective, as well as from an equity perspective, I think both of those pieces are critical.
All right, so next question. And Toulmin model was my jam. Now I miss teaching my debate argumentation class. So the next question is, we are lacking language and theory and practice to explain the concept of student learning and assessment. We pay attention to attendance, grades, course completion. What does it mean to ensure student learning?
I'll take this one for Cheryl. So I am going to throw into the chat a link to an activity. So not surprising, as a person that runs a National Institute with my background in philosophy, I have a philosophy activity that I'm going to share with you. There's one that's designed for faculty and one for student affairs. I'll put both in the chat in just a minute. But the point is to say, before we even engage in the process of assessing student learning, we have philosophical lenses is the way that we present it. There's 4 that are the most prevalent that guide our approach to this. And a lot of times we have multiple ones within a department. We have multiple ones across our institution. At different times, one is more prevalent than another. And knowing which one we're dealing with in our conversation can really help us not crosstalk each other. So I'll just give you a brief high-level overview. The one we hear most often is measurement. That assessment is about picking the right measure. So when you have a conversation with someone that's like, I have this outcome, how do I measure it? And it's like, no, we got to back up. We've been having this whole design conversation and intentionality and values and all of this sort of piece. We did not yet in any of our chat this afternoon get to measure. That comes later. And so, but there's a whole swath, and that's not to say you're wrong, that immediately starts with measure. I need a pre-post. It's got to be standardized. I got to make sure everybody got it. I need to have comparison. If my N size is too small, forget about it. I don't want to look at it. That's measurement. Another one is that compliance, which is, this is an add-on, it's bureaucratic. This is not about teaching and learning. I don't know why I have to do this. What do you want me to put on a report? Let me go back about my job. And that's really based from that experience that we've had about where assessment fits in that space. The third one is that student-centered, which is, how are students experiencing our learning? How are they knowing where they are in that learning trajectory so that they're like actively participating in their own learning and advancing to those learning outcomes? Most of our learning outcomes were written for us, not for our students. We don't tell our students about them. And then they leave going, what did I get from this? And we're like, critical thinking, problem solving skills. And they're like, what? No, I didn't. And you're like, oh, that was a class. And that's it's in the title of the class. I didn't get it. So really thinking about how are we actively engaging our students in knowing where they are in their own learning journey is another. And that looks very different. It has different measures. It has where you do it is very different. And the last is that teaching and learning that's about the questions of praxis that we have. And is this working for my students, and in what ways, and all of that. So I think first and foremost, I would say figure out what's your sort of combination of those. Do the activity, do it with a friend, do it alone, whatever. And then engage in conversations on, are we too heavy on this one? Is this where we want to be about my beliefs? And get to that consensus on, where do we need to be and what does assessment mean for us? And what does good assessment practice look like for us? Because good practice will look very different, and it depends on which one of those ones you want to do. But because of how assessment has been implemented, where you get to what's the measure and tell me how to do it. And so anytime you see a 5-step process that's going to change your life, red flag, pause, and go back to Cheryl's, find a safe place and talk to someone about it. Get into a conversation and reflect. But I'll throw those in there and engage. So there's not one way to do it. There's many. But being mindful of the decisions you make and what that means will help you immensely as you continue in your work.
I don't think I can add to that. I got so caught up in Natasha's response that I was just like, yes, I didn't even think of my own, and I apologize for that. But I right with you there. I really appreciate that.
Well, Natasha drops those links in the chat. I think we have time for one more question. And this one's a little California centric. So Cheryl, I think it might be good if we start with you anyway. But in California, we have ADTs, state structured degrees, that we use as a template for our local institutional degrees. Considering that there are limitations required by our transfer partners, right? We don't function in a vacuum. How can we affect change upon our learning models while still meeting our four-year partners' requirements?
That's a great question. And while, yeah, it's a little bit California centric because it speaks to ADTs, I think it also applies to all the other schools in our region as community colleges, right? We're all aiming to articulate our students and transfer them if that's their intended destination. But, I think first and foremost, we have to engage with our intersegmental colleagues, that the four-year folks, UC, CSU, our privates, really engaging with them as we consider evolving program design and degree design. That keeps coming up in the conversations around CBE. How can we as a system implement CBE in ways that assure that our students will be able to transfer to our traditional partners when they're done? And, while I think in the intermediary, there's going to be things like the dual transcripts that show, the competency list versus the traditional course list. And then we have the regular transcript. I think it would be, best for all if we evolve to that more learning design or the learning profile that Natasha mentioned earlier, that lists all their competencies and then the evidence of that, whether it's a course or credit by exam or some other prior learning. So I think having those structures, if we really want to blow it up and redesign, then we have to engage our intersegmental partners. But even within our degrees, I think we have some latitude to work within. And the question, again, to go back, we have the 5-year reviews for our CID and ADTs, to really look at them and not say, well, they're still fine, but instead say, how can they be improved? And are they really still meeting the needs of our 4-year partners and employment partners? And redesigning and reestablishing coursework patterns within those. I think there's room for that, even separate from the conversation with our partners.
I'll just add that I think while the paradigm was written about what was going on within an institution and thinking about a learning system within a particular institution, those same 4 principles and points apply as you think about intersegmental partners. So, and I say that because the vast majority of conversations and relationships on a community college and a 4-year go one way, of the community college going, can you tell me what you're doing? Did you just change something and not talk to me about it? Why aren't you taking this thing that we just agreed upon? Did you just change a policy? Like, it's very one-sided, and which is not helpful for our students. There's not a good reason for that. A lot of our faculty came from these other institutions, so why you gotta hate? But I think the thinking about, are we being clear? Do we have a shared understanding of what we're going towards on some of these goals? Do we know how different pieces that align fit together? Are we doing this with our interests of our students at the center and really understanding that student movement, and that it's not about all these other kinds of things? We need to keep that as our North Star. And are we being clear and talking to each other? And so those 4 pieces can help really think, but I do think that something needs to help as well with the give and take of a 2-way relationship instead of a 1-way relationship, or a relationship that pulls another partner along. So that's, we can have a whole nother conversation on that one, but it is it should not be one-sided in that way. But the paradigm, I think, can help, at least in some regards.
Well, fantastic. I hate to cut this. I hate to say we're done, but our time is up. Cheryl and Natasha, thank you so much for just a fantastic panel. Really appreciated your commentary today, and you're taking so many questions.